right, so we're recording. And so, yeah, as I mentioned, I have all my lectures up on Blackboard as well. I'm not sure if you saw that, but under the syllabus as lecture one all the way through. So feel free to also download those lectures. Feel free to use those lectures as you need them and use them as additional resource. So we start with the word psychology. And if I were to start with an exercise, and I'll put it in the chat, can you give me 5 words that come to mind when you think of a psychologist? So I'll monitor the chat. Feel free to put whatever comes to mind. When you think of a psychologist, what comes to mind?
I would say like your mind,
Say it one more time.
like your mind.
Your mind. Okay, right. So something related to the mind. That's a good answer. What else?
Thoughts and emotions.
Thoughts and emotions. Yeah. Behavior. A person who investigates other people's psyche.
Maybe a mental state.
A mental state. We got analysis, a talk or a behavioral therapist. All right. Good. Fair enough. I think I have more than 5 going on in the chat. That's awesome. Brain functioning, personality. Now, if I were to ask you 5 words to describe a scientist, what would come to mind? A laboratory. Okay. So a lab. What else? Research, experiments, data, hypotheses, theories, etc. Now, it is interesting, and I love doing this exercise at the beginning of a term because, believe it or not, a psychologist can be a researcher, can be a scientist, and oftentimes we have a limited view as to what a psychologist does or what the scope of psychology is. If I were to ask the average person on the street, they would think of a psychologist as just someone who talks to you about your problems. But believe it or not, as you saw in the syllabus review in the previous video, psychologists study many different domains of life. We aren't just in the treatment room. We aren't just doing therapy. In fact, there are many psychologists who devote their whole life to research, hypotheses, experiments, data. Those same words that you use for a scientist are equally applicable to psychologists or the field of psychology in general. If you go to the college, you'll see in 4S, we have a whole host of psychology laboratories. So even in the field of psychology, you actually have lab research. So it's pretty cool to get you thinking beyond just the traditional view of what we study in psychology. All right. So, but let's get started in terms of a brief history lesson of psychology. And when I say brief, I'm not going to belabor the point. In fact, you could take a whole semester course on the history of psychology. But I want to introduce you to one of the paradoxes of psychology. Psychology is viewed as both the oldest and the newest of the sciences. So when we think about how could you be the oldest and newest discipline? Well, if you go back to ancient philosophy, ancient Greece, you'll see that a lot of the ideas that were being talked about or written about are actually psychological principles. So at its origin, psychology is deeply rooted in philosophy. But as a discipline, it's a fairly young discipline. So if you were to think of people studying biology or chemistry or physics, we're talking a much longer history, whereas psychology as a science only becomes a formal science in 1879. So it's a new science, right? So it's the modern scientific principles that we use are from the late 1800s forward. So that's kind of our paradox. We're studying the same things philosophers were doing, but now we're applying it to scientific principles. So let's go through some of these earlier philosophers, and you'll see how they fit in with psychology. So if we were to go back to ancient Greece, there was a philosopher by the name of Socrates, and there are some core principles that Socrates had. One, he believed knowledge is innate, and two, the mind is separable from the body. Now, what's interesting is that at this point in philosophy, they viewed the mind and the soul fairly synonymous. So if the soul can transcend the body and there is this reincarnation, then that soul that enters the new body enters the new body with knowledge. So there is this belief that knowledge is innate. Now, this point is relevant to a debate of nature versus nurture. And that's one of the early debates we have, is whether knowledge or a skill set is innate, which would be the nature side of the argument, or nurture, is it due to direct experience? So the other side of the argument was Aristotle. And Aristotle said the exact opposite of Socrates. He said, no, the soul is not separable from the body. When a person dies, they die entirely. There is no reincarnation, and therefore there is no recycling of the soul, and there is no pre-existing knowledge, right? So according to Aristotle, then, how do we acquire knowledge? Knowledge is acquired through experience. So Socrates says we're born with information. Aristotle says we learn through experience. So Aristotle would be on the nurture side of the argument. Now, who do you think is right? Is Socrates or Aristotle right? Ada, who do you think is right? Socrates or Aristotle?
I think Aristotle is more right because we learn over time.
Okay, right. So Ada is saying Aristotle because we learn over time.
I
Vincent,
feel I feel like neither one is right. Just depends on who you think is right in that matter.
so that's a classic answer in philosophy. How do we know right? Right. So you could speculate. So neither is right.
I think it would really depend, like your thought process and who you believe is more right about the matter.
Okay. So your position is neither is truly right. Let me see if I could call on some other people as well. Jaden, who do you think is right?
I kind of agree with Vincent there. Like, I don't believe any of them are right, and it's kind of like
Hmm.
you know, if like philosophy, psychology is just like you like the minds is whatever you think is like what you think, kind of
Mhm.
thing. So I don't really believe any of them are right, to be honest.
Does anyone have a different, thank you for that, Jaden. Does anyone have a different position? Anyone have a different thought on the matter?
I think I do.
Go for it. And then I see Gabriel next. Go for
Okay.
it. Jaden.
So, instead, I don't think that they're both wrong. I think that they're actually both right.
Oh,
Yeah.
interesting. They're both right.
Yeah, I think it's like a situational thing. Sometimes it could be nature, sometimes it could be nurture, and sometimes it is both.
All right.
It's just dependent upon the situation and circumstances.
So currently we have Aristotle was right, and then we have neither was right because it's speculative in its philosophy. And now we have the position that they're both right. I think there was another hand, but it dropped. Were you going to say the same thing, Gabriel?
Yeah, I was actually going to say the same thing, that both are actually like a balance of both principles. Both Socrates and Aristotle are actually, they kind of go hand in hand, like you have like sometimes you do need to like experience the world, like thinking you got to nurture yourself, you got to like essentially treat yourself, in a way. But then it's like there are times where like you got to utilize that pre-existing knowledge to kind of like survive, because in the real world there's things happen, so you have to learn to adapt and such.
Right on. Samuel, it looks like you unmuted yourself. Is there something you want to add? All right. Well, so I'm going to answer the question. Well, we have three positions. Who's actually right in the class? The answer is that third position we found to be right. We need both innate information as well as acquired knowledge to fully function in society. And you might say, well, what are we born with? What information do we have that we're born with? Well, when we get to developmental psychology, we're going to talk about a whole host of reflexes that we're born with that we don't think about, that we have that innate knowledge, innate ability. But for most things, and I understand why one of your peers thought of Aristotle, a lot of things we truly need to learn, right? Because if everything were fully innate, then you wouldn't actually need this class, right? You should know everything because in one of your previous reincarnations, you would have acquired this knowledge or parts of this knowledge, right? So you shouldn't even need this class if it was fully innate. But it's not, right? Nothing is fully innate, but not everything is fully acquired. So interesting, this concept of nature versus nurture, which is the debate between Aristotle and Socrates, it continues to today. And I'm going to tell you the correct answer of the nature versus nurture debate is actually it's a combination of the two. So instead of saying nature versus nurture, why not say nature via nurture, right? So our innate abilities being drawn out by our experience. And you'll see the rest of this history lesson or early history lesson in philosophy is recycling of these two arguments until we get to Immanuel Kant. So when we think about medieval philosophy and Christian philosophy goes from ancient Greece to the 1300s. We start to see that Christianity starts to dominate the thinking, and the way that we acquire information is through religious contemplation. Now, that was a mindset, and you might have heard the term the Dark Ages. Well, the Dark Ages happened in Europe. They did not happen in Middle Eastern, Northern African communities because it was not as much emphasis on faith-based, but more based on reasoning. So many of the Islamic communities continue to develop. Many of the Jewish communities and Buddhist communities continue to develop because it was based on reasoning. And one of the things that happens is to break free from the Dark Ages, Thomas Aquinas basically said that, you know what, you can know God through reasoning. So it is okay to use principles of logic in understanding of God and in understanding the world around you. So in the history of philosophy, people like Thomas Aquinas, they're referred to as part of the scholastic movement, or scholasticism was the process of reconciling logic with faith. And that was a big shift, because as soon as you start to allow logic to be integrated with faith, it allows a broader spectrum of information to come through. So let's fast forward to the Renaissance, and we have people like Rene Descartes and John Locke. Now, I'm going to tell you that Rene Descartes and John Locke recycled the arguments of Socrates and Aristotle to some degree. So Rene Descartes believed that the mind is separate from the body, and the mind continues to exist after the body dies. Now, what's interesting is if he stopped there, then we would say, well, why do we need Descartes, right? Descartes is just recycling the idea of Socrates. But he also introduced the concept of dualism. Descartes said the mind influences the body, but the body can also influence the mind, right? So think about that for a second. The mind can influence the body. Sure, that makes sense, right? So if I were to ask you to raise your hand, physically raise your hand, that originates in the brain, and a message is sent to the body to actually execute that action. But the body can also influence the mind. For example, let's imagine that you're on the phone and you're talking and you're cooking, right? And because you're multitasking, you might have gotten distracted and you put your hand too close to the fire. Well, what's going to happen? Well, immediately you're going to pull back your hand. And then you're going to say, hey, that wasn't very careful of me. Maybe next time I'm going to keep my hand farther away from the fire. So that learning process and the change in behavior that happens subsequent to getting burnt is the body influencing the mind. So it goes both ways. Now, this was revolutionary because before Descartes, there was a belief that it was only one directional, only the mind influenced the body, right? So that was pretty revolutionary. Now, there is a famous quote from Rene Descartes as well that I think is important. And he says, I think, therefore I am. And the first act of believing in existence is, the first act of existence is believing that one exists. So the phrase, I think, therefore I am, is a classic phrase linked or attributed to Rene Descartes. Now, how do we have this connection between the mind and the body? Well, he believed in this idea of like nerves that or tubes that animal spirits flowed through. Now, the term animal spirits was it's not real, but it's basically uh, life energy. That was the term he's using. And it travels through tubes, which we now call nerves. Now, why did he believe that they were hollow tubes? Well, what's interesting is that in the time of Descartes, we start to see automata being created, which are machines that could do human like activities. And they often relied on hydraulics. So water pressure would flow through the tubes and get these inanimate objects to do human like actions. So if you search automata, you'll see. But many of the aristocrats of the day would have these automata on their lawn. And because they operated based on hydraulics, Descartes applied it to us as well. Now, if you want to know, well, where is the seat of the soul? Where does the mind and the body meet? Descartes believed it was the pineal gland. Now, why the pineal gland? The truth is, at his time of day, they understood different parts of the brain, but the functioning of the pineal gland was unknown, and it was a darker region of the brain, and it was mysterious. So Descartes assumed that that was the place where the mind and the body met. Now, was he right? No. We use the whole brain. It isn't just the pineal gland. Do we have animal spirits flowing through hollow tubes? No. We have neurological or nerve impulses that allow the connection between the brain and brain, spinal cord, and the rest of the body. But the idea, keep in mind, was still revolutionary because he's trying to bring us forward. So not everything Descartes said was true, but we teach it because it continued the conversation in a way that brought us forward towards a better understanding. Now, I'm going to bring you back to John Locke, but another contemporary of Descartes was Francis Bacon, or Sir Francis Bacon. And he was a philosopher, but instead of understanding how the mind works, he wanted to understand how the mind makes mistakes. So he was like, well, how do we get faulty thinking? Right? So he talked about the concept of an illusory correlation, which is basically looking for patterns in random events, right? So instead of looking at how we function properly, it's how do we make mistakes? How do we make errors of thinking? Now, I will come back to the concept of an illusory correlation later in the lecture, but hold on to that concept. John Locke. John Locke was also in the Renaissance period, and he rejected Descartes' belief of innate ideas, right? So if he rejects the principles of Descartes, he's also rejecting the principles of Socrates. So you'll see that Descartes and Socrates are paired together. John Locke and Aristotle are paired together. Now, what's interesting about John Locke is that he says we're born tabula rasa, or a blank slate at birth, sort of like an empty piece of paper before you came into this lecture. It's empty, but as you're taking this class, you're taking notes, and it's making an impression on your mind. The same thing can be said about human beings. The way we acquire knowledge is through experience, and that blank slate gets etched with our experience. Now, so tabula rasa, born with nothing, is similar to Aristotle. And the way we acquire knowledge is through experience. Now, he also talks about the concept of empiricism. So empiricism comes through a experience, which we said, and direct observation. So for something to have empirical evidence, you have to have direct observation or experimentation to say that you have empirical data. It can't be speculative. So you're already starting to see this shift away from traditional philosophy towards science and observation experimentation. Now, Mill believed in associationism. Now, I introduce you to Mill because when we talk about learning and behavior, which is its own lecture, we use associations. So when we talk about classical conditioning, operant condition, observational learning, the principles of Mill are relevant. So making associations. Now, I asked you earlier, and I appreciated your responses, right? So who was right, Socrates or Aristotle? Well, Immanuel Kant resolved this debate even as a philosopher. He said, wait a minute, we need both a priori and a posteriori knowledge, right? So we use and benefit from information that we're born with, but we also benefit from knowledge that's acquired through experience. So think about that. Even at this point in history, we're saying, no, it's a combination of the two. So that third position that came up from your peers, which it's not that both are wrong, it's both are correct to some degree, right? We need both. One in an absence of the other is incomplete. And I think that's the punchline in terms of philosophy. But I said that psychology was both the oldest and the newest of science, of disciplines. I said the oldest because psychology was deeply rooted in philosophy. The newest because of it becoming a scientific discipline. Now, who is the father of psychology? We generally believe that it's Wilhelm Wundt. So before you came into this class, you might have heard the name Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud is not the founding father of psychology. He is the founding father of talk therapy, right? And psychoanalysis. But psychology as a discipline, we give credit to Wilhelm Wundt. So let's talk about him. Well, one of the things we see is Wundt establishes the first psych laboratory in Leipzig, Germany. And he establishes this in 1869. And he uses the scientific principles to study the mind. Now, what was Wundt interested in? Consciousness. So he tried to understand how we process our conscious experience. So he believed in a principle of apperception, which is building up these building blocks of consciousness. And these mental elements come together to provide meaning for consciousness, right? So he's building consciousness up. Now, his student Titchener takes the opposite approach, which is structuralism, but breaking it down to its elemental stages. So you start with a conscious experience and you break it down. Now, he also measured reaction time and latency as it relates to stimulus detection. And he wrote a whole lot. He averaged in his lifetime 2.2 pages per day, right? 2.2 pages. Imagine writing so many journals or books or scholarly works that on average you wrote 2.2 pages a day. That's huge, right? So many different aspects of psychology were influenced by his work. So modern neuroscience was influenced by Wundt. Sensation and perception was influenced by Wundt. Developmental psychology was influenced by Wundt. Social psychology was influenced by Wundt, and so forth. So even though he focused on consciousness, he did write about other things. And he also was responsible for creating the first truly psychological journal. Now, if you're going to build a science, you have to have an avenue for researchers to publish their work. So Wundt created the first truly psychological journal. So structuralism. Structuralism focuses on the elements of the mind. I said Wundt's student was Titchener. So Edward Bradford Titchener, he took Wundt's principle and went the other way. So instead of trying to understand consciousness as a holistic idea or how we build consciousness to get up as a full entity, he wanted to break it down into its elemental parts. Now, you might think the word elements sounds familiar, and it does. There's another place where we hear about elements. Think about the periodic table of elements that we have with chemistry. Now, chemistry, you have over 100 elements, but Titchener, he came to an understanding that we had roughly 44,000 mental elements. And these mental elements come together for the experience of sensation and perception. So he wanted psychology to be very similar to chemistry and the periodic table of elements. By the 1920s, at the end of his life, he rejected the concept of mental elements altogether, right? 44,000 mental elements is a little bit too much. And he said, yeah, maybe I got it wrong. But he spent his career trying to identify the parts of the conscious experience, the smallest parts. Now, he also used introspection as a technique for people to say, tell me what you are experienced when I present such and such stimulus. So let's say I show a rose. Well, is it a rose or is it a reddish color, silky texture, pleasantly fragrant plant-like object? You hear? So from breaking things down to its elements, he would want to know about the redness of the rose. He would want to know about the texture of the rose, the fragrance of the rose, not just that it is a rose, right? So, long story short, he tried to break things down more than just labeling the object. So it's a labeling error when you are using sensation perception, according to Titchener. Now, one of the problems with asking people to reflect on their experience is that introspection requires a level of insight that he required a certain IQ, a certain level of intelligence, and it varied from person to person. So introspection as a technique for research was inconsistent. So that's another criticism. Now, if I were to sum up the question of structuralism, and I went back to the previous slide, Structuralism would ask the question, what is the mind comprised of? Notice with structuralism, the question starts with a what statement. What is the mind comprised of? Right? So understanding the elements or understanding how the elements come together for conscious experience, that is a what statement. Now, I said that because I also want to introduce you to functionalism. So instead of asking a what question, there is a question of why or how. So from a functional point of view, the question isn't what are the elements of the mind, it's how do these mental processes help us survive? So the focus was on survival and adaptation. So the key player here is Charles Darwin, right? So Charles Darwin wouldn't care about um, taste and smell as a sense, but how we use taste and smell to survive, right? How we use vision. So if I were to take the eye, a structuralist would say, well, what are the parts of the human eye, right? Whereas a functionalist would ask the question, how does vision promote survival? So it's a big question. Now, which one's more important? It's similar to the previous question. We need both. Structuralism had its benefit because it gave us the basic building blocks, the basic knowledge that we could grow from. But once we have the foundational knowledge, functionalism is where it's at. And you'll see that the concept of structuralism died out. There are no subfields called structuralism. But all of the subfields of psychology now focus on functionalism or the adaptive experience. So I'm going to stop here and I'm going to give you your 10-minute break and we'll come back at 10:44.